fully detailed report, 60 years after Bloody Sunday, is America repeating history? This is the Rethink report. Let's break it down. 60 years ago, on March 7, 1965, a group of 600 peaceful demonstrators set out from Selma, Alabama, to demand their right to vote. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were met with nightsticks, tear gas, and police on horseback beating them to the ground. The nation watched in horror as television cameras broadcast the brutality. What followed was a national reckoning, leading to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most consequential civil rights laws in American history. Now, in 2025, thousands have gathered in Selma once again, but this time the march is shadowed by a chilling sense of déjà vu. Across the country, new voting restrictions, gerrymandering, and Supreme Court rulings have eroded key protections that the original marchers fought for. Civil rights leaders warn that America is not just remembering history, it is repeating it. The original Bloody Sunday, a moment that changed America. The Selma March was part of a larger movement to dismantle the racist voting laws of the Jim Crow South. At the time, Black Americans in places like Alabama faced nearly impossible barriers to registering to vote, literacy tests, poll taxes, and even threats of violence. John Lewis, a 25-year-old activist at the time, led the march alongside Hosea Williams. What they encountered at the bridge was state-sanctioned violence. Troopers struck Lewis in the head with a club, fracturing his skull. Protesters were beaten unconscious. Television footage of the bloodshed outraged the nation, forcing President Lyndon B. Johnson to act. Within months, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law, banning racial discrimination in voting and requiring federal oversight of election laws in states with histories of voter suppression. For decades, the law was a pillar of American democracy until the Supreme Court struck down key provisions in 2013. How voting rights have been rolled back. The 2013 case Shelby County v. Holder effectively dismantled the heart of the Voting Rights Act by eliminating the pre-clearance rule, which required states with a history of racial discrimination to get federal approval before changing their voting laws. Almost immediately, states began passing new voter ID laws, reducing early voting days and closing polling places in predominantly black neighborhoods. The result: in states like Georgia and Texas, voter registration rates among Black and Latino communities have declined for the first time in decades. In 2021, the Supreme Court further weakened voting protections in Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee, making it harder to challenge voting laws that disproportionately impact minorities. Critics argue that these decisions have ushered in a new era of voter suppression, with laws that disproportionately affect Black, Latino, and Indigenous voters.
Republican arguments, state control versus federal oversight. While Democrats and civil rights activists call for restoring federal voting protections, Republicans argue that states should have full control over their own election laws without federal interference. Conservative lawmakers insist that voter ID laws and other election changes are necessary to prevent fraud and ensure election integrity, though studies have found that in-person voter fraud is extremely rare. Some Republicans also argue that Democrats exaggerate the impact of new voting laws for political gain. The result is a deeply polarized battle over voting rights, with no clear path to compromise. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Will it pass? In response to these rollbacks, House Democrats have reintroduced the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would restore federal oversight of voting laws in states with histories of discrimination. The bill has passed the House before but has repeatedly stalled in the Senate. With a divided Congress and Republican resistance, the bill's future remains uncertain, but civil rights activists insist that without new protections, the very rights won in 1965 are slipping away. The modern civil rights struggle, economic inequality, and police brutality fight for civil rights today extends far beyond voting rights. Activists in Selma are also raising concerns about racial disparities in wealth, education, and policing. Black Americans still face higher unemployment rates, lower home ownership rates, and a massive racial wealth gap. Meanwhile, incidents of police violence against Black men continue to spark protest, with many drawing comparisons to the brutality seen on Bloody Sunday. The anniversary march serves as a reminder that the civil rights movement was never just about voting, it was about dignity, equality, and justice. How this compares to past anniversaries. Previous anniversaries of Bloody Sunday have drawn major political figures, including former Presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. But this year feels different. The 50th anniversary in 2015 was a celebration of progress, with then President Obama declaring that America is a more just society because of Selma. In contrast, the 60th anniversary is marked by fear, frustration, and urgency, as activists worry that the progress of the last 60 years is being reversed. How the U.S. compares to other democracies on voting rights compared to other developed nations. The U.S. has some of the most restrictive voting policies. In countries like Canada, Germany, and Sweden, voter registration is automatic, and elections take place on weekends to maximize participation. Meanwhile, the U.S. has some of the lowest voter turnout rates among developed democracies. While other countries are working to expand access to voting, many states in the U.S. are actively making it harder to vote. This international contrast highlights just how unique and fragile American democracy truly is. A moment of reckoning. What happens next? The anniversary of Bloody Sunday is not just about remembering the past, it is about shaping the future. Civil rights leaders are calling on young people to get involved in activism, arguing that the right to vote must be defended, not taken for granted. Marchers in Selma are urging Americans to support voting rights legislation, push back against racial discrimination, and demand accountability from political leaders. As thousands cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge once again, one question lingers. Will this anniversary serve as a rallying cry for renewed activism, or will America continue to see the erosion of the very rights that were won 60 years ago? Follow Rethink Report for the full story.